morning, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion. We're this morning going to be talking about what's hot in the Nordic investment market in life sciences. And I have a really interesting panel here for you today. I'm Simon Curtis. I'm a partner at Clarkson. We are a firm of IP professionals serving the Nordic market, particularly in life sciences, very strongly over the last 25 years. And if I start to introduce to my panelists, we firstly have Ingrid Akay of Hadean Ventures. Ingrid, pass over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon. So yes, I'm Ingrid Akay, founder and managing partner of Hadean Ventures, which is a pretty traditional life science venture firm. We invest across the life science spectrum, pharma, biotech, medtech, diagnostics, digital health, across Europe with a particular focus on the Nordic region. We have our headquarters in Oslo, and we also have a Stockholm office. And at this point, the majority of our portfolio companies are based in the Nordics, but we also have investments outside as well.
And Andreas Jurgeit of Lundbeckfonden Emerge.
Thanks so much, Sam. Yes, I'm working with Lundbeckfonden Emerge, which is the early stage venture fund of the Lundbeck Foundation, a Danish industrial foundation with both an investment arm as well as a philanthropic arm. We spend about $100 million each year just in Denmark alone on basic research, but we have multiple investment arms. We are a traditional venture fund with a Danish focus, Nordic focus, so we always need some link to Denmark. Ticket size is below $1 million, up to $20 million. Evergreen, which means we have quite some time to build companies, but we operate like any other venture fund. We are indication agnostic and basically look into anything that can change patient benefit and solve a medical need.
Thanks, Andreas. And Karl, Xavier of Axilium Capital.
Yes. So we're an early stage startup investor. I ran the investment side out of Axilium Holding. We have tech investments and life science investments. We go in fairly early, ticket sizes around the 400 to 500,000 euro, and fairly opportunistic. Geographically, we'll invest anywhere, but of course, with all things equal, we'll prefer closer to home. So most of our investments are in Europe, a couple on the way to the US now.
Excellent, thank you. And Maria Tell of Almi Invest.
All right, I'm Maria Tell. I'm an investment manager of Almi Invest here in Stockholm. We're an active early stage investor. We invest in all industries with a focus on tech and life sciences. And within life sciences, we invest broadly within all areas from pharma to medtech to diagnostics, biotech, e-health. We always invest together with other private investors, which means we have close cooperations with science parks, business incubators, business angel networks, and so on. We can cover up to 50% of an investment round. The rest must be covered by new external investors. Our first investment is typically around 1 to 3 million Swedish crowns, and we can invest up to 10 million per company over time. We strive to be active owners, and we typically require board representation to do that. We are divided into 8 regional funds and 1 national green tech fund. We in total we have around 3 billion Swedish crowns in our national funds. And we can only invest in Swedish companies.
Thank you, Maria. And let's move on quickly to the discussion. The overall theme, of course, is about what's hot in the Nordic life science market. And I wonder, should we be looking at this in terms of technology or in terms of the indication that we're looking at, and what are the diseases that we're trying to treat? Andreas, do you have any comment on that?
I mean, we are very indication and technology agnostic. At the end of the day, we are driven by value creation. as all investors. We're very happy to take risk if the terminal value justifies the risk. And the good thing is that since we're also patient benefit driven, patient benefit is usually also what leads to payment in the reimbursement system or in the medical system. So it's very well aligned. So we have investments across pretty much all indications: oncology, metabolic disease, neuromuscular disease, you call it, we have it. But the one thing that unites all of our investments is that it always starts with breakthrough science, something that hasn't been tried before. Since we do early stage investments, we can usually not do Me Too approaches, so we have to go into the risk, and that's what we are willing to do.
Thank you, Ingrid. Does that reflect the way that that you would look upon exciting new prospects too?
Yeah, absolutely. As mentioned, we're also technology and indication agnostic. I think that in general, you know, healthcare is booming, and that goes everywhere. And sort of one of the silver linings of the current epidemic situation, there's a renewed focus on products that can make healthcare and treatment of patients more efficient. So I think the industry benefits from that. In terms of our investment focus, you know, we have this particular attention to the Nordic region, and we are bottom up, which means that, you know, there are certain areas of strength in the region that sort of is reflected in what we have invested into, and that includes immunology, oncology, neurology, for example, certain areas within medtech, and also digital health is an area of strength of the region.
Yes, I think I would agree with that. And Karl, that's digital health is something that I think you've focused on significantly. How do you see that developing in the Nordics at the moment?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because we're looking at technology separately, and we're looking at life science, but really technology is disappearing as a sector, because everything's technology. You can be a furniture company and you're a technology company. And it's definitely the same in the life science space. So you've got more technology specific with e-health, baking in AI, but you're really getting these paradigm shifts now. And there may be 10, 15, 20 years before the technology is leading to sort of new products reaching the market, primarily through technology. But I think even today we're seeing technology assisting along the way, making things more efficient, making things safer, making things faster. Running virtual experiments, for example, so that when you do the actual experiment, which you still have to do, and you have to go through all your trials, but you have a greater chance of success, which increases efficiency and reduces cost.
Thanks, and I wonder how the market looks at those trials and assesses the way that those treatments might perform against more traditional pharmaceutical treatments, where, you know, perhaps there's less of a safety risk with devices and IT solutions. Maria, how do you see that the regulatory and market positioning of these, and how do you assess that in making your investment?
I mean, that's of course an important part of what we look at when we look at an investment case. I think traditionally there's a gap in funding, at least in Sweden, which many companies face, particularly within pharma, where there is early stage funding, but then there's a gap towards the later stage funding. And this has been something that probably more common for pharma companies, but now I think it's an increasing problem within medtech as well, with the new, as you said, regulations, meaning greater demands on showing clinical effect in order to achieve the CE mark and so on. And this will, of course, extend development times and increase costs within the medtech space as well, and require additional funding and so on.
Thank you. Yeah, and is there any indication that it's easier or more difficult to gain adequate compensation in IT powered technology. And Andreas, did you have a thought about that?
I mean, technology and life science merging is a trend that is happening. It started probably in the 90s and continues. The question is, are you a tool along the value chain, or are you actually reaching the patient? And then this is a moving target, because we are basically witnessing these days how even computer games can be reimbursed as a treatment. And in probably 10, 20 years from now, we will all look at it very differently, because at the end of the day, does it really matter how you help a patient? No, it does not. But we are traditionally used to paying for a pill. And now we get more and more used to paying for service, paying for efficacy, paying for benefit. I don't have a clear answer to it, but I'm very certain that it will change over time. Will it make the healthcare system cheaper? I don't know, but it will definitely make it more diverse.
Thanks, thanks, Andreas. Of course, one of the aspects of investing in life science companies of any hue is going to be looking carefully at their intellectual property position. It's really a necessary part of forming a life science company, perhaps because of the huge investment and time that needs to be put into validating the treatment. So what is it that investors are looking for in companies' IP strategies, and what is it that makes somebody look like a good prospect in terms of an IP position when you're looking at that stage in due diligence? Maria.
I think, I mean, we typically look at the strength of the patent, of course, and what it actually protects. Is it broad or is it very specific? What's the strategy behind that decision? Is there potential to broaden the portfolio going forward? Is the geographic coverage relevant in terms of where you will actually be able to get paid for the end product? The time from filing is also important, of course, in terms of the future exit value. But I think it's important to consider a holistic approach to your IP strategy. And this, I mean, of course, includes patents, but also know-how and other aspects.
Absolutely. And of course, ensuring that there's a route to market around others' IP is clearly a key part of that. But I wonder how often it is that you see a company who's got something that's so revolutionary that there is absolutely no relevant IP in the way, and question perhaps, is it most important to see that a company understands what the competition's IP is like, and what the background IP is like, and sees a way to pick through this? Ingrid, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would just say that it's a substantial part of the due diligence that we do. It's a big focus, and it's not sort of, I wouldn't classify it as a nice to have or a positive. It's a requirement that there's a sensible IP strategy. We sometimes see granted patents, but usually there are patent applications, right? And we look at, as Maria said, the same thing. We look at, is the patent covering what we needed to cover, and what does the freedom to operate look like? Those sort of the areas that we look for. We sometimes get the questions, what else? What about, trademarks? What about trade secrets? And we look at patents. That's sort of what matters for us, typically. The only exception I would say is within the software space, where we see the situation a bit different. There we There we go a little bit later, and we more rely on market traction as a barrier to entry than solely on the comprehensive patent portfolio.
Okay. Karl, does that reflect your experience of looking at health tech companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're talking, as Ingrid said, on the software side, it's different, right? You've got your algorithm. That's your protection. We're not generally wouldn't patent that. I think it's useless and a waste of money. But on the rest of the industry, absolutely, we want a robust patent strategy in place. We want it to be as broad as possible, obviously, and we want to. I mean, that's where the main value creation will be in the end. That's what someone's buying at the end of the day. And you can patent things that are secondary as well to what you're doing to add even more value. So yeah, we look closely at that.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, and certainly add that there's a potentially rich seam of patents to be had in the interface, actually, of software with traditional medical treatments, in that where a disease indication can be shown to be treated more successfully through the application of software, patent offices can be quite keen to grant patents to that. So it's certainly an interesting area. We also wonder how smaller funds are competing with some of the larger international funds. What is it perhaps that smaller funds can bring that larger ones aren't able to? What's their advantage, Andreas?
I believe, I mean, intrinsically, if you have a large fund, you usually have to go internationally, maybe even globally. That means that as a result, you can't be that close to each of the early cases. As a small fund, you're usually drawn towards earlier, smaller investment rounds, building companies, building value, de-risking it. That's what we're doing as well. We have a little bit benefit that we can go very early with small tickets, and we can also do large rounds later on. But there's this strange situation that very often your best investments require the biggest checks later on, especially if you talk about biopharma. So it could be that you de-risk it significantly with the first $5 million or 5 million euros, but then to really build value, you need another 25, 30 million. And if you don't have that in the fund, then somebody else captures the upside because you don't de-risk the case enough to justify an up round that doesn't dilute you significantly. So positioning yourself as a small fund in, for example, biopharmaceuticals, where value creation happens traditionally at clinical proof of concept, is a tough one, is a very tough one. And that means that you have to find your own niches, and you have to be maybe even a specialist in a certain field that allows you to be more capital efficient. But overall, it always helps to have more money. The best combination is that you can go early, that you can build companies, but that you also have the time and the capital to then scale and grow them later on. But that's not always compatible with the overall structure of many VC funds. So it has to be an ecosystem. You need local players that enable, that build and de-risk, and you need some of the larger funding structures that help you to scale businesses.
Thank you. Yeah, Ingrid, we often hear investors talking about the team being as important as the technology in building a business. To what extent do you help that team to get itself started and perhaps to build it a little? And is that an example of something that a small fund can really bring?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I would say, first of all, just add to what Andreas said just now. I mean, the life science industry is a bit odd from the perspective that, you know, there's almost syndication going on, right? So you know, with the capital requirements of an investment case, it's very rare that, you know, whether you're a small or a large fund, you do this by yourself. So you know, it basically creates a sort of competitive, collaborative situation where, you know, if I have a great investment case, I run over to my competitor and show it to them, right? Which often doesn't happen in other industries. So, you know, it's a situation where we sort of leverage other strengths. And as Andreas said, you know, larger funds have more firepower. Smaller funds sit closer to the local environment. They know the ground really well, and the situation that these companies operate in. They can sit close to the management teams of the companies we invest into, and work closely with them. And to your point, Simon, helping build a team is one of the most important things we do. We invest into people we think are competent and you know, has the potential to continue building the company, but the teams are rarely complete at that stage. So one of the most important tasks that we have is to function as a, you know, part-time headhunter and go around and look for people to fill the gaps that the companies had, and bring in the right people at the right stage.
Thank you, Maria. Of course, your investment drivers are very much that they're focused on local in terms of Sweden. And very early investment. So does that reflect your experience too?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with what both Andreas and Ingrid are saying. I think that both the larger and the smaller funds are needed in the general funding ecosystem. And our role as a smaller fund is often to help the companies bridge over the larger investors or funds. And we often help them with many aspects, including structure, corporate governance, and so on, that need to be in place before the larger funds can go in. And I'd also say, I mean, as Ingrid was saying, we're part-time headhunters. I would agree. And we also have good relationships with and close contact with many of the larger funds active in Sweden, as we think we have complementary roles. And since we invest earlier than they do, in perhaps the same companies.
And Karl, what's your experience of this?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that's been said there. I think it's kind of a case of reverse scale. When you've got the bigger VCs, you just look at the economics of it, the cost of doing their full due diligence, the salaries of the portfolio managers. It just doesn't work to do these early stage investments because they're too small. You know, there's no way you can get a return on it. And I think that's where the smaller investors come into play. I think the smaller investors are also good at being very flexible, which is required in the beginning. And they're good at building teams, as we said, and they're local, so they can be close, they can meet often, they can sit on the board, and they can actually help to then prepare the companies for when the big guys need to make their entry.
Thank you. That's a really interesting perspective. Of course, it won't have escaped anybody's attention that we're speaking to each other without being in the same room, and that's because of something that's happening out in the real world at the moment. We can't fail to address whether the COVID-19 pandemic has affected investment decisions and the landscape. Andreas, where do you see the position at the moment? Whether companies are doing better or worse, and what the outlook is?
I mean, it very much depends on the company. If you plan the fundraising right when the pandemic started, it was obviously not good timing, because a lot in our business is being face-to-face, building trust, and sharing risk. And as human beings, evolutionary, traditionally, we do that by looking into each other's eyes, faces, see how we react. That changed. We are on Zoom today, not in a panel in Stockholm. So yes, we can't ignore that. So from a company perspective, timing made a big influence. From an industry perspective, with multiple sides, many of the big deals that we've seen being announced during the pandemic, they happened before the pandemic. So diligence happened, all of that. We will have to wait and see how BD and M&A will play out in the year or 2 years to come. Many deals that are announced have been in the making for often half a year or a year. So there could be a slowdown, maybe there is not, because industry has money to spend and there are opportunities. From the venture fund or venture industry perspective, We will have to wait and see how the impact on the fundraising cycles looks like. I'm lucky I'm part of an evergreen balance sheet structure, so I don't have to go out fundraising, but remembering the days back in traditional funds, when you go fundraising, you meet limited partners, you tell your story. We are pitching like any other startup would do. And depending on the track record, it's harder or it's easier. And this might have an impact, but we will have to wait and see. We just don't know yet.
Ingrid, is that something that you're expecting to affect you, and do you have any more views generally?
Yeah, you think I'm just fascinated with the speed that everything has happened at and is happening at. You know, the speed of the epidemic spread out, the speed of the shutdown, the speed of the recoveries, you know, when everything, you know, crashed in the markets, and then it was like a quick rebound, the speed of the second wave, if that's what we're seeing right now, you know, so everything is moving really fast. I think that from a portfolio perspective, what we saw was that, you know, there definitely was a impact on the clinical trials. The hospitals, you know, shut down for any other activity than to treat COVID patients, right, for a while. But I was surprised how you know, when things started to open up again, how quickly things recovered as well from that perspective. And let's see how it develops. Nobody really knows what's going to happen next. From a funding perspective, it was really a bit of the same. You know, suddenly everything froze up. And then there was a rebound. Suddenly everybody had a lot of capital, and healthcare was really hot. So, you know, there's a lot of interest in healthcare. So I think it's really difficult to predict which way things are going. But at this point, it seems like because of the focus on healthcare, that right now the sector is hot with many investors. So. We hope that that lasts, and that the effects of COVID is not forgotten so easily.
Thank you, Karl. How do you think companies have been addressing the need for interim finance, especially if they've had development trials delayed?
Yeah, no, of course there's been delays. We've had delays in clinical validation trials that we're going to be running in Spain. And negotiating manufacturing contracts, etc., and that in some cases has required interim funding. I think the sort of worst case scenario that we all painted up in March, I think we're far away from that now. If you look at the stock market, it's at all-time high, which is not a direct indication, because the risk we're talking about here is liquidity risk. There's no shortage of cash in the market. All the people had the same amount of money now as they had before sort of COVID, and the sort of people that are investing, they're not directly affected by the downturn. So I think it's a mix depending on what phase you're at. Some cases the government has stepped in and helped. In Denmark, they've been great at that, for example, and in Sweden to a lesser extent, but also assisting. And there's been internal rounds being done in a few companies. But at the end of the day, the VCs haven't closed their doors. They need to invest the money, as I think Andreas said before. So investments are being made. It's just a little bit slower.
Thanks. And Maria, how's it affected your outlook as a publicly owned investor?
Yes. I mean, we definitely see more deal flow, but also new types of deals, including later stage cases that perhaps needed to be more creative and look for other types of investment than they otherwise would. We saw, as the others have been commenting, we saw a general halt in the market early on in the pandemic with the lower valuations, and but now we see that the private investors and the business angels are starting to invest again, but perhaps they're more careful in their approach, and everything might take a bit longer due to not meeting physically and so on. And I mean, in our case, we really try to be more active than ever, but we require syndication, and that's, I guess that's the challenge.
Which I think perhaps neatly cues us up to the next theme, which is are we likely to see more syndication in early deals? And I guess, given your experiences, Maria, we should probably hear from you first on that point.
I think the answer is yes. I think the climate has changed in general, and many of business angels, for example, are more reluctant to invest or willing to invest in smaller amounts and so on. If I speak for us, since we're a state-owned fund, our regulations require syndication, and we also think that that's something that really strengthens the companies that we invest in. So all in all, no big change in how we look at syndication. It's always been very important to us, but perhaps a change in the attitude in terms of that it's also going to be more important for others going forward.
Karl, do you typically look for syndication partners in any deal that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, Ingrid said it really well before. You know, you ask people like us who our competitors are, and we sort of throw up our hands. We want to invest with other people. We want to share the risk. We want someone else to do a due diligence and come to the same conclusion as us, that this is an interesting investment case. So everyone wants to syndicate, and that's going to increase more and more because the world is becoming more global. The technology is there to assist us, so it's actually easier to syndicate now. And maybe we'll get onto that later, but there's also mechanisms coming into play that allow for new types of investments, much smaller investors to come in as well, so-called micro investing. And that's going to lead to sort of sub-syndication, which then syndicate into the main round.
That's very interesting. Ingrid, is there anything that management teams can do to help push along the process of syndication?
I think first of all that there's a tailwind, as we all been talking about, you know, both in sort of the local ecosystem, but also we see that the overall European VC ecosystem has developed a lot over the last few years. Funds are getting larger and the more funds, and we see sort of more of the spill-off effect that you have the larger European funds looking for deals sort of more in, what to say, the outer regions of Europe. So we see more interest for syndicating deals in the Nordics than we have seen before. And I think one of the things that management teams can do to help that process is to keep an open mind of the benefits of the VC model, because obviously it has both pros and cons. It is a particular way of investing. You know, there are large amounts of capital. It's, you know, we like to accelerate the timelines, and we like to sort of be actively engaged. So you have a particular type of investors when you take a VC syndicate, and not all startup companies are familiar or used to working that way. So I think just keeping an open mind for that model and the benefits of that is helpful.
Andreas, you noted earlier that it's important to, or has traditionally been important, to be able to look somebody in the eye when you're building a syndicate. Does that perhaps slow down the process? The necessity to do that? Is there a way that a syndicate can be built very quickly?
It very much depends. It depends on the market. I've worked in the US before. You can build syndicates within weeks and close a deal within less than a month. If it's competitive, Europe is traditionally not that competitive. It's just how it is. It's about critical mass. What I've seen now in the last months is that you hold on much more to the network that you already have. So you have not just the polite discussions, but also the no bullshit discussions, like, why is that case good? Why is it not good? And that's what you have to have. If you want to build a company, if you go in early, and you take a lot of risk, you share a lot of risk. And very often when we build syndicates, it's not just for the capital, it's very much for the people that are in the syndicate. You want to have somebody on the board that has experience in a certain indication in a certain type of company. And they've made mistakes before, they've paid for them before. So if you get them on board, you get all the learning on board as well. And that's true for the investors and for the company. So syndicate is much more than just capital. And that's also one thing we see non-traditional means of investing popping up. Then the question is, do you just provide capital? So if you have pools of investors, might be micro investment or you name it. But traditionally in healthcare, it's much more important to get the right people and the right competences around the table. But there's always a mix of both. So nothing changes.
Absolutely, and you noted in there that there's not so much competition in the Nordic region for investment. Is there actually enough support and local capital for innovation to thrive and be adequately funded here? Andreas.
Ooh. I mean, I only moved to the Nordics 1.5 years ago, so I always try to benchmark and reflect because I worked in the US, I worked all over Europe, Israel, everywhere, and I believe there is sufficient capital, and sometimes sufficient or even too much capital gives companies too much time not to leave their comfort zone. So, because it's what you want to build is a company that even failing quickly can be the best outcome for many companies, and for that you also need capital. But too long drizzle financing only leads to a very sluggish ecosystem. So what I tell all the companies I've been working with or worked with is that expose yourself to broad criticism and feedback as early as you can, as soon as you have a story that you're able to tell and that is solid. You cannot approach investors too early because traditionally VCs are very curious, but you have to know how you tell your story. What is your value proposition? All of that. If you have figured that out, then go out there, talk to people. And the knowledge and the feedback you get from people are as valuable as the capital. And usually if you build a valuable case, then the capital follows. So don't see it as an exercise just to find money. There have been plenty of companies with plenty of capital that burned it all and didn't generate value. Go out there, talk to people, know how to ask the right questions, also be sensitive to the questions that you get. If three professionals in a row ask you about CMC and you can't answer the question, then maybe that's something you should look into. And if all of that comes together, then you might actually have a viable chance to build a company. And then there's still biology and the clinical risk, but money and people are there. So I'm quite open. So I don't think we have a bottleneck in financing in the Nordics. At least I haven't seen it. Much more that we don't push companies to go out of their comfort zone.
And your experience, I think you said, is mostly in Denmark.
Yep.
Maria, in terms of Sweden, you're obviously very early in through the doors of a company. How are companies finding the next stage of investment in Sweden?
I think there is funding and support in the early phases, but then there's definitely a gap in Sweden that forces many companies, particularly within pharma, but now also, as we said before, increasingly in other areas as well, to look abroad for later stage funding, kind of Series A and above. We experience a gap and the need for capital in the space kind of between where our money goes and where our capacity is, and the first step for other institutional investors. And in that phase, it is difficult for companies to raise capital today.
Karl, where do you think companies are going to raise that capital at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, they're scrounging around it's the angels and it's the earlier stage VCs, which is getting better because, I mean, the PE funds are sort of moving down, which pushes down the VCs, I think, and you're getting more investment there. So this gap is definitely there, but it's getting a bit smaller. But also rolling GPs is a new phenomenon that's sort of starting. I think that's great. And then you get micro LPs, meaning that you can actually funnel money from this huge pool of retail investors into venture with very small amounts. And from an asset allocation point of view, for them, it's great. I mean, these are upper middle class and above retail investors, non-professionals, but running perpetual investment funds. I think a lot of funds can be tapped there, and that'll give benefit to sort of all of society. And I think they need to do that a bit more aggressively in the Nordics, and to break out of this comfort zone, as Andreas said. I mean, if you go to Industrifonden, the first thing they'll ask you is, when are you going to go to the US? How's the FDA approval process going? So I think we need to be a bit braver in the Nordics and head out first for advice, and then really have a plan to get out there. And that'll mean the money will come too.
I think we've got a couple more minutes left, Ingrid. We'd love to hear from you on this too.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the Nordic ecosystem, we're active across the Nordics. It depends a little bit about which stage we're talking about and which country we're talking about, because obviously it's not exactly the same across the region. Andreas said Denmark is probably one of the countries here that are sort of more developed. I think that we definitely have a ecosystem that has developed a lot and is developing, so it is getting better. But I agree with Maria that in the sort of Series A type investments, there's still a gap there. It is good when it comes to early stage soft funding, etc. And that's really what you want, right? You want to have sufficient funding to develop the projects that come out of the excellent research we have here. So I think there's no limit really what you can create of opportunities there. It's just that how wide and how daring they want to be in that space, and that's something I think that the Nordics are good at and can still further be developed. So overall, in summary, I think we're not there yet in terms of being a developed ecosystem, but we're definitely moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Ingrid. And I think that leaves us at about time's up. It leaves me to thank you all for taking part. I think that's been a really interesting discussion. And I would say an extremely optimistic outlook from you all as regards to what's happening in the Nordic life science space at the moment. I think we can wish all of the companies that are with us today the best of luck, and it feels like it's a good time to be pushing forward. I hope all of the panelists will be available to answer a couple of questions through some of the online portals that we have. But it leaves me to say only thank you very much for joining us.